Picking up in Paul Johnson's A History of the Jews. Just a reminder to our readers, you may wish to do some research on Paul Johnson and what his particular view is, but some might find these readings of this history somewhat secular in nature, which is usually the case with most serious historical accounts. That being said, that sometimes that derivative will give way to differences in opinions as to how certain decisions were made by the characters therein, that history, whereas religious figures, for example, the rabbis would, and ministers to a certain degree, may look at the psychology of the characters and how they arrived at their decisions or actions in a way different than the academic. But the interest in this subject matter is various. So I'm just glad you decided to stop by, and we're going to pick up again. We're still in part 1, the Israelites, on page 54, which would be, I guess it would be you could say it's the second paragraph in. Picking up, among the mercenaries Saul had recruited was David. It was his policy. When Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he took him unto him. But the Bible text, as it stands, confuses two distinct layers of David's military career. He was originally a shepherd, descending from the humble and enchanting Ruth, the Moabites. When first picked to serve, he knew nothing of arms. He girded on sword and armor, and tried in vain to go, for he was not used to them. He used a more primitive weapon, the sling, to achieve his great first exploit, the killing of the Philistine strongman Goliath. But another version has David brought to Saul's attention because he is cunning in playing, and a mighty valiant man, and a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person. The truth seems that The truth seems to be that David served Saul at different periods, but his professional military training came as a mercenary under the Philistines themselves. He learned their methods of warfare, including the use of their new iron weapons, and he flourished to the point where King Achish of Gath awarded him a feudal fiefdom. He might have identified himself wholly with the Philistines, but in the end he chose the throne of Judah, partly as a Philistine commander, partly as an opposition leader to the blundering Saul. He built up a group of professional knights and soldiers who swore fealty to him, were attached to him personally, and expected to be rewarded with land. This was the force which enabled him to become king of Judah after Saul's death. He then awaited for dissensions to break out in the northern kingdom, Israel, and the murder of Saul's successor there, Ishbaal. At this point, the elders of Israel offered him the throne of the north by constitutional covenant. It is important to grasp that David's kingdom was not initially, at least, a coordinated nation, but two separate national entities, each of which had a separate contract with him personally. David became the most successful and unpopular king Israel ever had. Sorry, no. David became the most successful and, yes, David became the most successful and popular king Israel ever had, the archetype king, the ruler, so that for more than 2,000 years after his death, Jews saw his reign as a golden age. Okay, I just want to say, although a much more popular figure, this is a personal footnote, um, as far as David being the archetype of kingship, uh, not so much. I'm gonna split it down the line a bit, um, and say that that's more of a Christian perspective. The Jews themselves see as the archetype the Messiah, Moshiach, uh, king-like figure that should be um, aspired or emulated or whatever would be Hezekiah. Hezekiah. However, you can split that in half again too and consider whether that appreciation is more about a Mashiach-like figure to come or the actual king-like figure, in which case some would argue that David was the prototype king in that. He's definitely the most popular, and he is the name attributed to the future king or Messiah that was to come, is to come, etc., etc., attributed to Jesus's lineage for the Christians as well. But just wanted to throw that in there. Opinions vary on that slightly. So reading that again. David became the most successful and popular king Israel ever had, the archetype king and ruler, so that for more than 2,000 years after his death, Jews saw his reign as a golden age. At the time, however, his rule was always precarious. His most dependable forces were not Israelites at all, but his personal guards of foreign mercenaries, the Cherethites and Pelethites. His power rested on a professional army whose officers had to be rewarded by gifts of land they could turn into feudal fiefs to support their men. But to donate the land, he had first to take it, and this could not always be done by conquest. Hence the series of revolts and conspiracies against his rule, the most serious of which was led by his own son Absalom. The tribes were still separatists by instinct. They resented the cost of David's campaigns. They resented the cost of David's campaigns, perhaps still more the centralizing tendencies he accelerated, and the apparatus of Oriental kingship he introduced. A chancellery and secretariat, a harem, the corvée, an elaborate court. These rural folk felt they had no share in the new style state and echoed the anguish cry of Sheba, the Benjamite, who blew a trumpet and said, "We have no part in David, neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel." All these revolts were put down thanks to David's military machine, But the reign of 40 years was never untroubled, and harem intrigues over the succession, inseparable from monarchical polygamy, continued to the end. David was none the less a great king, and for three reasons. First, he conflated the regal and the sacerdotal role in a way which was never possible for Saul. Samuel had no immediate successor, and much of his spiritual authority devolved on David. David, despite his occasional wickedness, was evidently a man of deep religious feeling. Like his son and heir Solomon, he had many gifts, including a strong artistic imagination. The tradition that he was a musician, a poet, and psalmist is too strong to be rejected. The Bible records that he took a personal part in ritual dancing. He seems to have transformed a throne created by brutal military necessity into a glittering institution which combined religious sanction, oriental luxury, and new standards of culture. Conservative rustic chiefs might not like it, but the popular masses found it exciting and satisfying. Secondly, David's position as king priest seemed to have received divine blessings, since his purely military achievements were unrivaled. He decisively defeated the Philistines and pinned them permanently into a narrow coastal strip. Saul had done much to reduce the remaining Canaanite enclaves within the area of Israelite settlement, but David completed the process. Okay, personal note right here. He decisively defeated the Philistines and pinned them permanently into a narrow coastal strip. Oh, how clever. You see what's being suggested here, right? It's creating the illusion of a Palestinian state before the coastal state of Philistia, right? And it was compressed that way due to the wars. We have no reason to believe that. I mean, first of all, no. It was one of 10 Canaanite states, okay? Compressed. It's, okay, these kind of things you're going to have to research for yourself. But you got to be careful. It's true. Sometimes the theologians are quite justified in attacking the academics for some of the things they introduce, okay, in our modern times. Okay, there are certain names of modern states that must be used in the universities by the academics if they hope to achieve their degrees these days. We know this. Anyway, I don't want to go off on this, Ray, but please be careful. Do your homework if something sounds suspicious, okay? And I don't mind that Johnson may have some biases. I don't. I really don't. But I just hope for our readers' sake they take some time to recognize some of these biases as they come up. Concerning the present day situation too, I think it might help if they did so, rather than add to more cynicism, etc. Picking up. Saul had done much to reduce the remaining Canaanite enclaves within the area of Israelite settlement, but David completed the process. He then moved. See? Okay. Again, the remaining Canaanite enclaves. Right? These were all separate states. There were 10 that I know of. And Philistia being the second smallest next to Gad, I believe it was called. you know? I mean, there were several. It wasn't one united Philistia or Philistine. It was not. We know this, but anyway, again, he, with this last sentence, he recognizes that. But to the reader who doesn't know about the history of this point in time, he might just peruse over these lines and not really know what is being suggested here. If you, okay, like, reduce the remaining Canaanite enclaves within the area, like when you read past that, you don't think of fully realized um, um, Canaanite states, tribes, or kingdoms. You think of like little scrappy villages or something, And there's no reason to just assume that. Anyway, moving on. He then moved east, south, and north, establishing his authority over Ammon, Moab, Edom, Aram, Zobar, and even Aram, Damascus, in the far northeast. His military successors were rounded off by diplomatic alliances and dynastic marriages. In a sense, this burgeoning little Israelite empire was dependent on an accident of history. The empire to the south, Egypt, had receded. The empires to the east of Assyria and Babylon had not yet matured. In the vacuum, David's kingdom flourished. This is an interesting point, and I'm actually glad Johnson emphasized it. Exactly right. Exactly right. Um, in the surrounding studies of history during this point and in this area, it's important to take note what was happening in the surrounding nations and territories around him. I've often suspected this. Like we like to think of David's and Solomon's reign as some sort of great glory, right? I'm sure to a visiting Queen of Sheba, coming to see her. Anyway, that might have, it spins an impressive picture. But, to understand that, I'm just saying, I suspected at a very young age that position in, let's call it Judea, or a greater Israel, before the split up, north and south, let's just say that the political situation surrounding it definitely helped David establish things there. Definitely there was something to be taken advantage of there, right? To have, yeah, I'm glad he mentioned that. So that's good. It's not really a put down. I'm just saying that, yeah. Had any of the superpowers been in a position to have pushed up hard against him, they probably could have squeezed him out just as easily as the rest of the Canaanite enclaves were squeezed to death. Anyway. Let's see. Picking up. But his own capacity and experience, his width of knowledge, his travels, and his grasp of economic factors also made the expansions possible. He saw the significance of establishing his authority over the great regional trade routes, and he opened up economic and cultural contacts with the rich city kingdom of Tyre. He was an internationalist, whereas earlier Israelite leaders had all been narrow regionalists. Okay, it's also important to remember that the specifics in the situation and the specifics geared towards exposing David's character isn't always so celebrated by other historians. For some, especially in our modern period now, there's a great deal of debate among academics as to whether or not such a history of David and Solomon and that period of time can be so deeply expanded upon, because it's rather sparse and a lot of people have their doubts about its um, about its I don't know, legitimacy outside of religious positions and the biblical canon itself, which is not to say that excludes it from fact or having had happen or whatever. But there certainly remains some space for questions to be asked. Let's put it that way. So Johnson going way deep here. Understand that a lot of this is speculatory. Like he's speculating about the character of David and why this was what, because a lot of his contemporaries, as well as modern day scholarship, would suggest that, I'm not saying I take this position, but that the whole story of David wasn't even located in that area, and that it was writings from different periods and different geographies that somehow culminated from one of the suggestions is Egypt itself, but we don't have to go there. I think there was a reason why Simon Schaumann, and in his History of the Jews, the 2-volume set, which I highly recommend, starts his history with the returning of the exiles, from Babylon, picking up history from that point, because I guess he just really, well, you can speculate as to why he wanted to pick up from there, but that he wasn't too confident in the shabby historicity of this period. He really wasn't. And that's to be understood. You can respect that decision. You don't necessarily have to take it yourself, but there it was. But here, it's pretty clear that Johnson seems to be a historian that's taking the provided text we may have biblically and expressing through his speculations a detailed analysis of something that may not even have been. We've got to face that. But at the same time, you know what I mean. At the same time, you could say that his speculations and expansions upon the given materials through research provide us quite possibly with something very real. I mean, what I'm saying is, when it comes to the history hole that we jump into, you just don't know. You present your views usually from the sources from which you explore. But when someone takes on a certain style of writing, not everyone's comfortable with sitting there quoting all their source material. So the reader himself, if they're not familiar with all the source material, they have no way of differentiating between the writer's personal position and the utilization of source material. Just saying. Anyway, I'm getting a lot of myself in this, and I really shouldn't be doing that. Let's pick up and see if we can keep rolling here. Thirdly, David established a national and religious capital, which was also his personal conquest. The Israelites had never been able to take Jerusalem in over 200 years, though it was the most strategically important city of the interior. And as for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out. But the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah unto this day. Jerusalem controlled the main north-south route in the interior. More, it was the natural junction between north and south. The failure to take it was one of the most important reasons why two separate groupings of the Israelites emerged. I'm not even going to comment this time. Whoever approaches this book with any background research experience is going to have a lot of issues and questions for it, and it's to be understood. And that's not a criticism, I'm just saying. It seems Johnson takes a stance on particular issues that he wishes to illustrate in his unravelings. The failure to take it was one of the most important reasons why two separate groupings of the Israelites emerged, what later became known as the Kingdom of Israel in the north and the Kingdom of Judah in the south. By taking Jerusalem, David believed he could weld the two halves into one, and it is clear that the siege was a deliberate political as well as military act. Only the king and his men, the professional household troops, not the tribal levies, were used, thus ensuring that David could claim that the city was a personal conquest. It was, in fact, known forever after as the City of David. He took the place of a great stroke of daring, of which his general, Joab, was the hero. The old city of Jerusalem, which we know today, is built on three valleys, the Hinnom, west, Kedron, east, and Tyropoeon, central, which merge to the south into the brook of Kedron, or Kedron. The much smaller Jebusite city water supply from the Gihon Spring. The much smaller Jebusite city covered merely the eastern ridge, the only one which had a reliable water supply from the Gihon Spring. Thanks to the excavations of Kathleen Kenyon and the second book of Samuel, we know exactly what happened at David's siege. The Jebusites, like the citizens of other Palestine cities at this time, such as Gezer, Gibeon, and Megiddo, had constructed a secret tunnel connecting the interior of the city to the spring, so that they were assured of water even in a siege. They thought this device their strength, and so confident were they of defying David that they staged a magic ritual parade of the blind, lame, and other deformed people to enlarge the Israelites. But it proved their weakness, for the king knew of the tunnel and called for volunteers. And David said on that day, Whosoever getteth up to the gutter and smiteth the Jebusites, and the lame and the blind that are hated of David's soul, he shall be chief and captain. Joab and his men performed this exploit, climbing up the water tunnel, and so getting inside the walls and taking the city by surprise. David's subsequent behavior in Jerusalem confirms the view that it was of great political importance to him. He did not massacre the inhabitants or expel them. On the contrary, he seems to have been anxious to turn them into faithful personal adherents of his. He repaired the walls and the terracing of Milo, occupied the citadel, or Zion, as it was called, built a barracks for his mighty men, a palace for himself, and purchased from the last ruler of the city the land on which an essential shrine for the entire Israelite people could be erected. He then brought the ark, which was the most precious religious relic the Israelites possessed, and the symbol of their unity, and placed it in his own city under the protection of his throne and personal army. All these acts were to strengthen his personal position and to identify the national religion, the entire people, and the crown with himself and his line. But what he did not do was as important as what he did do. David seems to have been much more conscious of the nature of the Israelite religion and community than either Saul or any of his own successors. Like Gideon, he grasped that it was indeed a theocracy and not a normal state. Hence the king could never be an absolute ruler on the usual Oriental pattern, nor indeed could the state, however governed, be absolute either. It was inherent in Israelite law, even at this stage, that although everyone had responsibilities and duties to society as a whole, society or its representative, the king or the state, could under no circumstances possess unlimited authority over the individual. Only God could do that. The Jews, unlike the Greeks and later the Romans, did not recognize such concepts as city, state, community as abstracts with legal personalities and rights and privileges. You could commit sins against man, and of course against God, and these sins were crimes, but there was no such thing as a crime, sin, against the state. This raises a central dilemma about Israelite, later Judaic religion, and its relationship with temporal power. The dilemma can be stated quite simply. Could the two institutions coexist without one fatally weakening the other? If the demands of religion were enforced, the state would have too little power to function. On the other hand, if the state were allowed to evolve normally, according to its nature, it would absorb part of the essence of the religion to itself and sterilize it. Each had an inherent tendency to be parasitical upon the other. If the Israelites tried to survive simply as a religious community without a state, they would sooner or later be attacked, scattered, and absorbed into the local paganisms. Thus the worship of Yahweh would succumb to external assault. That, of course, was what nearly happened during the Philistine invasion, and would have happened had the Israelites not turned to the secular salvation of kingship and a united state. On the other hand, if kingship and state became permanent, their inevitable characteristics and needs would encroach upon the religion, and the worship of Yahweh would succumb to internal corruption. The dilemma was unresolved throughout the first and second commonwealths. It remains unresolved in Israel today. One solution was for the Israelites to adopt kingship and the state only in times of great peril, as during the Philistine invasion. The evidence suggests that David would have liked to adopt this, but came to think it impractical. To defend his people and their faith, to make both secure from their external foes, He had not only to create a kingdom state, but immobilize its surrounding peoples. This meant he had to found and consolidate the house of David, with Jerusalem its capital and central shrine. But he plainly did not regard his kingship as normal. He understood the religion of Yahweh. He saw himself as a religious man. He had an additional role as a prophet, priest, and often performed as one in his music, writings, and dancing. It is significant that he established hereditary kingship without endorsing primogeniture. 3 of his elder sons, who might have succeeded, Absalom, Amnon, and Adonijah, all broke with him and died violently. In his old age, David designated his successor, the son he chose. Solomon was not an active general, but a scholar, a judge in the Mosaic tradition, the only one of the sons capable of discharging the religious duties of kingship, which David evidently felt essential to preserve the Israelite constitutional balance. It was also significant that David, while transferring the ark to Jerusalem to give his capital's status religious sanction, did not build a grandiose temple associated with his crown and royal line to house it. The ark was a humble piece of religious furniture, which originally contained the covenant itself. It was dear to the Israelites, reminding them of their lowly origins, and standing for the pristine orthodoxy and purity of their theocratic creed. The Bible account gives later justifications for David's failure to build a temple for it. God would not allow him, as he was above all a warrior, a man of blood. It was also said that he was too busy making war. The first excuse is certainly false for war, and the Israelite religion were closely associated. The first excuse is certainly false for war, and the Israelite religion were closely associated. The priests had special war calls for their trumpets. The ark could be, and sometimes was, carried on to the battlefield as a war emblem. David's wars were in the highest degree blessed by divine approval. The second excuse is more plausible. But David reigned in Jerusalem 33 years, many of which were peaceful, and if he had wanted to build a temple, he would have given it high precedence among his extensive building activities there. Personal footnote, I'll make this one a quick one. I find the number 33 years or 33 interesting. Christ, roughly, we usually say 33 years. Alexander the Great's death, 33 years, I believe it was. Some say 32. Hello, 30, it's curious, don't you think? Oh, coinky dink? You decide. Anyway, back to it. The likelihood is that he did not wish to change the nature and balance within the Israelite religion, and he felt that a central royal temple would do exactly that. In the old days, the ark had been the physical focus of Israelite worship. It was a symbol of theocratic democracy. Once they settled in Canaan, the Israelites gave thanks and sacrificed at high places, open altars on hills and mountains, or at more elaborate historic shrines where roofed buildings or temples were erected. We know of a dozen or so: Shiloh, Dan, Bethel, Gilgal, Mizpah, Bethlehem, Hebron, and 5 smaller ones. Their location followed the spinal cord of the country from north to south. They ensured some element of decentralization to the Israelite cult, as well as continuity with the past. For all these temple shrines had important associations for those who worshipped at them. It is likely that David, anxious as he was to ensure sufficient centralization of the community to provide its effective defense, did not wish to emasculate still further its democratic base. Hence his unwillingness to imitate the other kingly despots of his age and turn Israel into a royal temple state. Hence also one suspects his deathbed charge to his designated heir, the learned Solomon, to follow the Mosaic law in its purity, and keep the charge of the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments and his judgments and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses. That, he added, was the only way the throne would survive, by ensuring that the law in its plenitude and strictness balanced the demands of the new state. Let's read that again to make it clear. That, he added, was the only way the throne would survive, by ensuring that the law in its plenitude and strictness balanced the demands of the new state. That's what holds the Judean or Israelite state together. That. The law in its plenitude and strictness. Okay? Now, that's it right there. That's what holds the people together. It's all about the Mosaic law. And the Johnny-come-latelys that later came in to replace the former theology, the Paul of Tarsus, or I don't know, you want to call him St. Paul, or Saul, with his pulling away from the law under the comfort of Greco-Roman sensibilities, certainly didn't apply to the Jewish people or their ancients. And it did not even apply to Jesus by the very Gospels themselves. Jesus' position on the law was exactly the same. To reiterate, ensuring that the law in its plenitude and strictness balanced the demands of the new state. Adherence to the law, not the little ones or the ones you think make sense or the ones that, you agree with or transferred over into Christianity. No. From the greatest to the least of them. If you keep one, you keep them all. And that was Jesus' position too. And I don't care what Christianity went on to develop beyond that, changing all that for the Gentile world. Somewhere along the line in the development during the 1st and 2nd centuries, there was a departure from this and a creation of a new religion that had a little less to do with the beliefs of the Jesus that was worshipped by them. In fact, the Jesus that was worshipped by Christianity and that would go on to be worshipped by Christianity probably had very little to do with the real character of a Yeshua. If you start really examining the surrounding historical references and even Talmud, concerning a Yeshua. And I'm not talking about opinions about the person. I'm talking about source material, and not just source material, not just that examination, but the questioning of the Gospels themselves. As you can see, from Mark to John, there is an evolute agenda that they change over the next few decades. It seems like replacement theology myself, when even you just consider the date of the destruction of the temple and when the first gospel, which was Mark, not Matthew, was appearing on the scene. Coincidence? Again. Study that period, and I don't know. We all have to make our own decisions, but it depends on how you approach these things, whether it's emotionally based or, in this sense, it's historic. And anyway, there's been a lot of doubt in recent years attributed to the Gospels themselves as reliable documents. But I don't think we should dismiss them out of hand so much as we should suspect a manipulation in their formation through the first and second centuries, including books that would come later, as late as 200, with the books of Peter and stuff, trying to patch up any other questions that may have come up. It's becomes a bit of a circus, some would say, but I'm not here to I don't want to increase the amount of cynicism about these things, but I think we should be open about these things as we explore. How you live your life and what you decide to do is in fact important, surely. But when it comes to examining text and the historicity of some of these things, I think there's some room to be flexible. Anyway, back to it. Later generations sensed the depth of David's religious impulse, which illuminated his statesmanship. That is perhaps the final reason why they venerated his memory and wished to return to his rule, and it is no accident that he occupies more space than any other sovereign in the Old Testament. But David's heir, Solomon, was one of a totally different stamp. Where David was passionate, rash, willful, sinful, but repentant, conscious of sin, ultimately pure in heart and God-fearing, Solomon was a secular person, a man of his world and age to the bottom of his heart, if he had a heart. The Psalms, which are attributed to David in the Bible, are essentially spiritual in tone and content. They are close to the core of the religion of Yahweh. On the other hand, the biblical literature associated with Solomon, the wise sayings and the voluptuous poetry of the Song of Solomon, though fine of their kind, are much closer to the other ancient Near Eastern writings of the period. They lack Israelite Jewish transcendentalism and God awareness. What Solomon became was a Near Eastern monarch of outstanding What Solomon became was a Near Eastern monarch of outstanding skill, but his reputation for wisdom was based on a willingness to be ruthless. Though co-opted as king during his father's lifetime, when David's death made him sole ruler, he marked the change of regime and direction by eliminating all his father's former ministers, some by murder. He also made a critical change in military policy, In describing the revolt of Absalom against David, the second book of Samuel distinguishes between the old tribal levies, or the men of Israel, who supported the son, and the mercenaries, or servants of David, who naturally defended the king. It was these same servants who ensured Solomon's sole succession and enabled him to eliminate his opponents right at the beginning of his reign. David, while building up a mercenary army, had still used the men of Judah, or the tribal levy of the south, as the core of his main army. But the tribal levies of the north, or men of Israel, remained neutral or hostile to the crown, and Solomon decided to abolish them altogether. Instead, he introduced the corvée, or forced labor, which was applied to Canaanite areas and to the northern part of the kingdom, Judah itself being exempt. As a form of national service, forced labor was less honorable than serving in the levy, and more arduous, therefore more resented. Solomon employed it on a huge scale for his building programs. The first book of Kings, using government records, says that there were 80,000 men in the quarries, led and watched by 3,300 officers, 70,000 men hauling the stones to the sites, and 30,000 men sent in rotating batches of 10,000 each, who went to the Lebanon to cut timber for beams. Construction work included the enlargement and glorification of David's rather elementary scheme, involved building 3 new royal fortress cities in various parts of the country. And this is the reason of the levy, forced labor, which King Solomon raised to build the house of the Lord, and his own house, and Millo, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, and Megiddo, and Gezer. These last 3 cities, strategically sited, were virtually rebuilt by Solomon from scratch, using Israelites for the heavy labor, but imported masons for the skilled work. Excavation shows an altogether higher level of craftsmanship than the Israelites had yet demonstrated. It also reveals that the prime purpose of the cities was military, to provide bases for Solomon's new chariot army. David had never possessed a chariot force, the mark of a major power at this period. Solomon had about 1,500 chariots and 4,000 horses in his various stables. At Megiddo, strategically the most important of the lot, overlooking what was later to be known as the Plain of Armageddon, he built a high defended royal quarter with an immensely powerful gateway, and buildings which would house 150 chariots and 400 horses. Hazor, an abandoned city, was likewise given a royal quarter, gatehouse, walls, and huge stables. Gezer, a city he acquired by dowry, and which controlled the route to Egypt, he transformed into another royal chariot city. The very existence of these heavily defended royal quarters, rising above the ordinary houses of the city, was an affront to the Israelite theocratic democracy. Solomon needed his carefully disposed chariot forces to protect his trade routes and defend the realm from external assault. But it is clear that their purpose was also to maintain internal order, which they did with great efficiency, for the tribes had no chariots. For his ambitious program, Solomon needed not only labor but money, so he taxed the tribes too. David had prepared the way for this by holding a census, but he had been ferociously criticized for this, as contrary to the Israelite religion, and he recognized his sin. The episode was characteristic of his hesitation and ambivalence in building up the state at the expense of faith. Solomon had no such scruples. On the basis of the census, returns he divided the country into 12 tax districts, and imposed a further levy to provide supplies for his chariot cities, the other royal depots. But the resources of the kingdoms were not enough, so Solomon rationalized his father's conquest, retreating from Damascus, which was too expensive to defend, and yielding other territories in the northwest of Hiram, king of Tyre, whom he made his firm ally, in return for skilled craftsmen and supplies. But he also expanded commerce, trading extensively on his own account through king's merchants, and encouraging traders, both domestic and foreign, to use his routes, so he could tax them. The economy of the Near East was now entering fully into the Iron Age. We find the first iron blades used for plowing about this time, and the world was becoming richer. Solomon ensured by his activities that his royal house received a princely share of this new prosperity. He expanded trade by marrying daughters of all the neighboring princes with the slogan, "Trade follows the bride." He made affinity with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, by marrying his daughter. That is how he obtained Gezer. The Bible tells us of other matrimonial alliances, saying he loved many strange women together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites. His diplomacy and his trade were intertwined. The visit of Queen of Sheba, the visit of the Queen of Sheba, who came from South Arabia, was concerned with trade, for Solomon controlled the Arabian trade, chiefly in myrrh, frankincense, and spices. Josephus tells us that Solomon held riddle contests with Hiram of Tyre, another great trading monarch. This was a not unusual form of diplomatic exchange in the early Iron Age, involving heavy cash forfeits, sometimes cities, and was part of the bartering process. Solomon and Hiram jointly ran a fleet of ships from Ezion Geber in the south to Ophir, their name for East Africa. The two kings dealt in rare beasts and birds, sandalwood and ivory. In addition, Solomon was an arms merchant. He bought horses from Cilicia, which he sold to Egypt in return for chariots, which he then resold to kingdoms to the north of him. Solomon, in fact, was the arms supplier for a considerable part of the Near East. Near this his port of Ezion Geber, the American archaeologist Nelson Glueck found the copper refinery he built on the island of Herbert El Khalife, where the high prevailing winds worked the flues of primitive blast furnaces. This refined not only copper but iron, and produced finished articles